I do want to briefly talk about reimagining learning in a world of constant change, and end up with talking about how we may be able to blend epistemologies, some interesting ways to achieve things that Jim was talking about that may have been unthinkable just a few years ago. It's not mystery to anybody here that actually we are at a very amazing moment in terms of how things have been for the last actually 300 years, but I'll just take the last 100 years. In terms of almost all the infrastructures have had kind of what do you call an S-curve shape to them. There's a brief moment of radical innovation and then 50, 60, 70 years of stability. And I think, without being overly dramatic, that we are right now entering a Cambrian moment, kind of a moment in which is fantastic efflorescence. Spontaneous things are emerging left, right, and sideways. We have diversity all over the place. And the question is, how do we actually help to shape this? Because in a moment of radical change, shaping is now possible. I want to kind of step back and say, well, one thing we're doing is we're looking at kind of the profiles of being effective in the 21st century, not just kids, all of us. And one notion has to do with resiliency, and we all know that is almost kind of a cliche, but resiliency has a much deeper meaning. Resiliency has to be built into our systems in advance, like a strong immune system. And the second thing I would kind of cast our attention to is the simple notion of agency. One of the reasons the kids are bored is they want to do things, they want to be seen as actors, they want to have a sense of agency. But what we're really interested in is how do you create agency with empathy? I'm going to claim, and we can argue, that dispositions are now at least as important as knowledge and skills. What I mean by dispositions? A tendency to do things in a particular way, something that is kind of a contingent on the context and kind of shapes how we approach problems. But let's step back. How do we come to know? Many of us have grown up around Homo sapien, man or human, who knows? Man is knower. How we know, who knows? But as you already heard from Jim and Connie, we're looking now at how to branch that out to combine Homo sapien, man who knows, with Homo faber, man who makes. How do we start to take more seriously connecting head and hand? But what doesn't get talked about much is a third epistemological stance, and that is man as player, homo ludens, a very nuanced notion of play. And think about this play as how do you start to probe and push the boundaries of a system? That is a very important thing in a world that's constantly changing. And also think about this has to do with kind of how epiphany is generated. How basically you're playing with something that doesn't quite work out and then suddenly it falls in place. If you provide the opportunity for a kid to have an epiphany, that epiphany will stay with them for life. End of story. It is an amazing single-shot learning. So what we really have here is three epistemologies brought together in a way to create a sense of agency in order to do things. And Jim, I think that's what kids want to be able to do. They want to be able to do things. We may not understand what those things are, but they want to do things. If you look at our current weighting, we spend almost all our thinking on Homo sapiens, a little bit about Homo faber, and a tiny bit on the side about Homo ludens. I want to suggest that maybe we really kind of have this weighting wrong. Maybe it should be much more kind of equilateral in terms of how do we have equal balance of these things. And then doing that, how might we actually bring these three things together in terms of a way to kind of look at the world differently, almost a way to kind of cultivate imagination. How do you actually think about building ecosystems that are actually in service of the entrepreneurial learner? But that's just the start. I want to say that the final step is how do we move from networks to ecosystems and platforms that scaffold all the resources here so you get kind of productive friction, you have mutation, you have cross-pollination, and so these things are no longer silos connected, but suddenly they have come together in a way to construct a very, very powerful ecosystem of resources for purposes that we can't even think about ahead of time.